I'm just interested, as you've been observing and as you've been connecting and living through this experience, what are some of the signs of hope that you've started to see?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think one of the main signs of hope is this. We've tended a lot of, and I think theologians have been very guilty of this, and cultural commentators have been very guilty of this. Well, not guilty, but in a sense in which painting a declension narrative of modern society. Look, things are going to hell in a handcart. We're all kind of crawling around malls, Amazon consuming deracinated, alienated, exploited individuals with nothing in common. And there's been lots of stories, whether it's bowling alone or the end of social capital and these kinds of stories. And so one of the signs of hope was, I think, in response to the pandemic, the sudden kind of upsurge of mutual aid and the kind of recovery of a kind of localism and engagement with the existential needs of those around us. And that's both in the States, and seeing that in the UK, I think, is even more pronounced in the UK. And the ability to imagine ourselves as a society under threat. Now, I think one of the contrasts that's interesting, living on this side of the pond over and against the UK, is I've more hope of that in the UK. Obviously, you've seen the kind of demonstrations and stuff in the States, but one of the things that's very striking is in America, very few people, there isn't really any lived experience of national institutions, whether that's the NHS, the BBC, the National Trust. People from cradle to grave exist and have a visceral sense of national institutions, and therefore the sense of how do we operate as a society has kind of come to the fore. We saw that around the kind of clapping of the NHS and stuff. That's a very different picture over here. We have a resurgence of regional and local solidarity, but it's almost impossible to imagine a shared America anymore. And so that's, I think I'm kind of, it's a sign of hope for the UK at that kind of broader societal level and at a local level, that there's that recovery of a sense of the social life we depend on together, not merely to survive, but also to thrive. And that exists independent of the state, independent of the market. And we're not just collapsed into administrative units of the state or commodified units of the market. And so that has been a sign of hope to me. And then I think the other building out of that is, and I think we see this in some of the policy responses, there has been a sense that in contrast to the 2000-2008 financial crisis, where we bailed out the banks but not the homeowners, I think the move in policy terms, which took me by surprise, I will confess, I didn't expect it and I wouldn't have predicted it, but the move to support workers and distribute kind of resources, a distributive justice kind of model, and how do we keep people in employment and recognize that fabric is vital. That was a sign for hope of a certain kind of political imaginary that was possible. I think the last sign of hope for me is that certain things which weren't imaginable suddenly became obvious. So here, huge debate around prisons and kind of debate about abolition of prisons. That was like inconceivable. That was like a fantasy utopia, that our governor in North Carolina in the South would suddenly have mass release of prisoners. Turns out we're all abolitionists now. Like, it's a thing we can think of. And so that, I think that the way the pandemic has made what seemed impossible possible, and imaginable and doable. Now, there's negative sides of that. Suddenly we abolished school overnight. That's a remarkable thing. So there's worrying sides of that. But I think that it's a moment when certain things which couldn't even be imagined, seemed like utopian fantasies, suddenly that becomes possibilities. And the danger is we move past this and we lose that sense of possibility. Yeah. And so I think holding on to that kind of almost kind of, I would put it in theological terms as a kind of an apocalyptic vision. Apocalyptic in the sense that you see from a heavenly perspective what's really going on, but it's not just from a heavenly perspective. You see from the perspective of the poor and the persecuted as well what's going on. And I think this, I guess that would be my fourth thing. Certain things have been revealed. You know, it's clear we know what the class structure is now. Those who stay at home and those who go out and work with their hands. Like, that's been clarified and revealed. It's clear who essential workers are. It's clear that we need each other, even as we have to socially distance from each other. The pandemic makes clear we need each other to survive, let alone thrive. Interdependency. We are inherently enmeshed in the lives of each other. So certain things have been revealed, and certain vulnerability, who is rendered precarious and who is rendered safe, and who do we demand is rendered precarious so that others might be safe. Yeah. All of this has become revealed. So I think it is a certain apocalyptic in that sense of that term. I think in that's the scriptural sense, it's a revealing. Apocalypse literally just means a revealing. There's a revealing there, which I think we need to keep hold of again, even as the clouds come over, as we begin to kind of move into a different state.
That's really helpful. In some ways, you've marked out an awful lot of territory there of different things that we could explore. I like that kind of couplet of moving from surviving to thriving. Earlier in the day, I was talking to some people, and a number of them had younger children than I do, or that you do. In both of our cases, as either adults or nearly adults, whereas they got younger children who they were homeschooling, and the kind of trying to survive that and still do some of the mutual aid stuff effectively. Yeah. Is a massive challenge. That idea of moving from surviving to thriving. Just tease that out a little bit more. What do you mean by that? You know, what should I be saying to somebody who's desperately trying to get through every day? How can we talk about thriving in that kind of context?
Yeah. So I think it's a very ancient idea. Let me begin with a kind of how the ancient Greeks used to frame it, and then I'll put it in a biblical key. So in the kind of classical Greek thought, they made this distinction between Zoe, which was the mere life, and that was the animate life we shared with all animals and living things, and bios, which is not biology, but think about it more in terms of biography. And bios was the kind of a vision of flourishing, which involved a kind of shared moral and political life, and the kind of a sense of meaning and purpose in life beyond mere survival. And for someone like Aristotle, the city politics is the mechanism through which you move from Zoe, merely having a life, to some kind of flourishing life. And obviously for him, that was just for certain people, property owning males, and women, children, slaves were left out of that. I think there's a parallel idea. It's put very clearly in that ancient Greek terms. And this journey of becoming human is this journey of moving from surviving to thriving. In the biblical picture, if we think about the Genesis story, Adam, which just means human, is made of the Adamah, the soil, and the soil, and that's kind of the source of animate life. The soil is teeming with life, as we know from the microbiome and the rest of it, and all life comes from the soil. And it was this way of picturing how humans share animate life with all life. But Adam is not really human until he encounters Eve. And in the Hebrew, Eve is kind of means breath. He here at last is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. Through relations with another human, he can realize the fullness of what it means to be human. There's the life he shares with all animals and living things, and then there's particular life, that movement into, and it comes, further on in creation, and it's this sense of this journey into a movement. Now, then the question is, well, what does that picture of the flourishing life look like? In biblical terms, we have these various terms: shalom, the kind of we might talk about the peaceable kingdom. My colleague Stanley Hauerwas uses that term. There's Hebrew notions of tzedek or mishpat, the justice and righteousness, which was the covenantal order. So there's various ways of picturing and figuring flourishing in a consumer society. Have I got all the consumer goods? I'm looking at kind of travel programs and luxury holidays, and that there's that vision of flourishing as a kind of consumer paradise. There's a certain kind of technocratic vision of flourishing as the well-managed, governed society, beloved of new labor, technocratic apparatchiks. I'm being slightly naughty. But, there's that kind of, there's various competing visions of what human flourishing consists of. On a Christian key, the great paradox is, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. The picture of flourishing, unfortunately, is this picture of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's a picture of loving fellowship and kind of mutual aid, covenantal life of justice and righteousness shared together. So that in biblical terms, we make a distinction between prospering, which we, I think in the West, confuse as flourishing, having a lot, having a full belly, psychological states of contentment. And when people say they're not flourishing, they mean they're not happy because they're not happy in their head. They haven't got enough to eat. But we can make a distinction between that of prospering and flourishing, which is, are you living a life of justice and righteousness? Whatever your material circumstances, are you living a life of loving fellowship, of mutual care, of interdependence, of solidarity, on the picture of Jesus's life, death, and resurrection? That's true flourishing. So when we're stressed out with our kids, when we're struggling with mutual aid, that isn't divorced from the flourishing. And here, to go against the Greek model, it's not, often we separate and have this strong sense of a movement from Zoe to bios, from surviving to thriving. Actually, what we have in the Christian life is, in the act of surviving, when I cook for you, it's not just giving you a plate of pasta. I'm also saying you matter, and it's an act of love. I'm simultaneously surviving and thriving, and so that there's, whether it's symbolized in the Eucharist or acts of neighborliness, or the simply cooking a nice meal for my kids, saying hello to my elderly neighbor who lives alone and doing a bit of shopping for them. The very act of doing their shopping is an act that enables them to survive. And in the act is a gesture of loving care that is a movement into a world of meaning and purpose, where we share a common life characterized by justice and love. And I think that's really the fight, is always to ensure our modes of surviving are undertaken through being characterized by justice and love. And so I think, so that hopefully gives a richer picture, a kind of scriptural theological sense.
Just to push you a bit further on that, I guess most of us who are engaged in kind of community work, there are kind of default settings of what that looks like in practice, that actually in the majority of cases rely on physical presence and physical closeness and proximity to one another. I guess in some ways that we're living at a moment currently where that has been suspended. So how does that how does that envisage, and again, in a time of suspension, you can sit and lament what we can't do, or you can start to push towards what it might be that the future looks like. And I'm just wondering how you see that working out at this particular moment in history.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's wrong to say it's suspended. So it's gone into a different modality. So take the act of social distancing, that is simultaneously an act to survive and a gesture of care. It's in America, we're full of the people who say, oh, I'm not going to wear masks, and a kind of machismo sense of I'm not going to do this. They're in saying that, it's like they're actually saying, I don't care about you. I'm an island unto myself. My survival matters, and I'm going to do what the hell I want to ensure that. Your survival doesn't matter. And in saying that, they're saying there is no common life between us. It's a refusal of that interdependency, and that how I act affects you, and how there's no, in the South African theological use of the notion Ubuntu, there's no me without you or you without me. They're just utterly refusing that. Or there's very good work in the feminist ethics of care, exploring that interdependency idea. So there's a sense of, we've got these gestures which are at the same time doing that. Social sheltering in place is a mode of that. But then even within that, the care of the family, the care of the neighbor, the care of the street, the WhatsApp group, just to check in on people, checking in on people before the Zoom meeting, so that we're not treating people simply as biology, but we're all the time attending to them as having a biography, i.e. they're creatures with meaning and purpose and stories to tell and a voice, and that I can listen to them. And in the act of listening, whether it's on Zoom, whether my mum, she lives in London and she comes out, they have coffee together in their street, and she lives alone and is a kind of super shielder. She has kind of various conditions, and so, but her street, I'm deeply grateful to her street, who've just been beautiful, and will stop by, and she's kind of mostly blind, so they'll take the trouble to announce. She'll sit on her doorstep, and they'll take the trouble to announce who they are, and she'll chat to them, and so in that act, they're recognizing who she is. They're listening to her, witter on about whatever. But in the act of listening, they're saying, you matter. You're somebody. You have a biography. You have a story. You're a person. I'm not merely going to provide the food and then walk away, do your shopping and then walk away, as if you're merely biology. No, you're also a biography who can be listened to, and therefore we have a shared world of meaning and purpose that we share together, and there's only sustained and developed through those repeated gestures of care, whether in the home, whether in the street, whether in a broader frame of reference. And so that the work of care is the work of building up a common life, where the quality and character of that common life is one of justice and love. And it can be very simple gestures like spending 5 minutes chatting to my mum on the doorstep. It doesn't have to be the grand. We tend to think in these grand structural terms. And I think this is where a big problem is in our imaginaries of the world around us. Because when I do a lot of teaching around politics and political theology, and when we use the term politics, we tend to just think of party politics and the state. And we don't pay attention to how a large realm of politics is the cultivation of a common life amidst asymmetries of power and competing visions of the good. And that's in the neighborly life, in the WhatsApp group, in the kind of various stuff we're doing around about the place. That's the cultivation of the ecologies of trust, the ecologies of care, the reweaving the intermeshing that we all depend on to survive. And in that act, if we're doing that in a certain quality and character, we're ensuring then that the quality and character of our common life is then one of thriving rather than merely surviving. Yeah. And so I think that is going on regardless. And that's what, when I go back to what I said before about the hope bit,
yeah,
that the seeing the upsurge of mutual aid, not, and I would put it not as volunteering, it's often branded as volunteering. That's a depoliticization. It's not, the story of volunteering says the state does politics and competition for the state is politics. Everything else is somehow volunteering. And I'm like, no. Unless we have a thriving, rich ecologies of trust and care, mutual care, cultivated through forms of mutual aid, then the state gets to say everything about life. And so think about it coming out of the pandemic. If we're not cultivating robust forms of mutual aid, and we're totally dependent on the state, and coming out of this, we're rendered even more vulnerable. There's no shared world, and we all then serve the state rather than the state serving us. And so there's a lot at stake politically in this. It can seem as if this is all the nice kind of cuddly bit over here, and then here's politics. I'm like, no. Politics is premise, and that's Aristotle's point. Politics is the mechanism through which we move from surviving to thriving. And politics is what we're doing when the kids are out without masks and not social distancing at the end of the street, and I don't call the police, i.e. involve the state and law to mediate the relation. I go and talk to them, but I don't go and shout at them. I go and listen to them and recognize they have a biography, and chat to them and say, oh, hey guys, like, I'm not, and we deal with it through a cultivation of a common life. And we can think of myriad versions of that conversation and how it goes. And often we demand the state steps in, or we think that's the only mechanism to solve social conflicts. And something I've done a lot of work on is community organizing, and forms of community organizing and kind of democratic movements outside of party politics is crucially reweaving the fabric of a common life, so that we've got something together and some sense of togetherness that enables us to resist either there's a we independent of what the state says we are, and a we independent of merely being market actors with commercial exchanges between us, i.e. there's a rich common life between us, independent of state and market processes. And all the time the fight is the state and market want to alienate us from each other and render us individuals with no shared we outside of state and market. And if there's only the we of the market and the we of the state, i.e. national identity or whatever it is, then we're utterly dependent on those things and rendered completely vulnerable to them. It's only, and all social movements, that's why they're called social movements, whether it's a civil rights movement, a labor movement, feminist movement, ecological movement, whatever it is, emerge out of a richer sense of the social life we share together, trying to bring then accountability and re-embed state and market in that so it serves society, rather than society being entirely subordinated to state and market processes.
I'm going to give you 2 minutes to answer this last question, if that's all right. Yeah, I'm really intrigued by the trajectory that you're setting for mutual aid, actually. That it's not just in and of itself, but it's pushing us in a direction of an emergence within society. I guess just give us a couple of minutes on what are some of the other, when we spoke earlier, you used this great phrase, which I can't, about who is already living in this future.
Right, yeah.
Just give us a couple of minutes on the kinds of people that we might be looking to say, actually, they might show us a little bit about what this future looks like?
Yeah, so one of the things I've been trying to think about here, and obviously in the States, we've had a lot of disasters recently. And I was trying to think about who's living our future. Most of us, you know, if we're able to be at home and the rest of it, who's living our future now? And so I've been kind of listening, trying on podcasts, listening to people in recovering from disaster situation, and I've posted a piece, posted two pieces. Just I'm not free now, but just for further reflection, if you wanted the short pieces. One of them, I begin. It's the title of Work God Bless Us, which is the talk I gave a little while ago, but that begins with the story of some people in Puerto Rico recovering from Hurricane Maria in 2017, and how kind of mutual aid led into a broader kind of political process. And I think there is a lot to learn from folk recovering from disasters. Obviously, those are often quite localized, and this is a kind of generalized phenomena. But I think that's one thing. The other thing I think to learn from folk in those kinds of contexts, particularly if you're in pastoral work or in kind of community-based work, is disasters have a life cycle. So there's the moment the kind of disaster hits of you know, when things kind of all get turned upside down, and then this kind of upsurge of mutual aid and help, and everyone's, you know, there for each other. And then there's a kind of long tail of several years, and that's when you see things like domestic violence, self-medication, depression, mental health issues, as people kind of have a sense of isolated and coping and recovery by themselves. And I think that, again, it's a lesson, I think, from people who've lived through our future in the past, is there's lessons to be learned there for the world that is coming, that we, particularly those of us kind of charged with pastoral care in our communities in any shape or form, it's helpful. It gives us a kind of a sense to be alert to. But yeah, so those are the two things. And just to go back to the first one of those, apart from the life cycle, which is the mutual aid stuff, crucial there is then, how do we respond in ways? The temptation is to kind of move into a philanthropic noblesse oblige. I'm an Anglican Episcopalian, and that's always our default mode. You know, we love to be the ones who kind of do things for others. And it lacks that properly neighborly, reciprocal, we're kind of mutual care kind of form. And the sense of also in that, in how do we respond in ways that genuinely build up people's agency to act for themselves? So rather than simply providing the service, how do we develop a service that doesn't just kind of create and replicate further dependency? It might be more efficient to do it that way, but it tends to the ways people are already acting and caring for themselves, and the connections they have, and what do they have energy to act together around. And that begins again with listening. Are we beginning with listening? Or are we beginning with already knowing I already know what you need? And that's where, again, I mean, this is a lesson I take from community organizing work, you know, the importance of the act of listening, which takes people's stories, takes their biography seriously, and attends to how they're already acting. So how can we help enhance that agency rather than provide services or responses that demand people kind of move to where we're at or what we want to do, rather than kind of it coming around and supplementing and enhancing the ways people are already recovering and making sense of their world around them.